Thank you, Rob and Southwest Writers, for inviting me today. I always like to come and see what's going on at Southwest Writers and speak here. I've been here a number of times. I always learn a lot and make some new friends. Today I'm going to talk about beginnings, and I'm calling this Writing Your Way In. Although it's really bigger than that, because as you all know, because you're writers, writing your way in can take forever and feel like it's never going to end. But the actual beginning of your story or your book or your memoir eventually does get solidified into something that is the beginning you're going to use. So what I want to do today is talk about what beginnings accomplish and why they're so important, what to look for in beginnings, and I'm going to take us through a series of examples of beginnings that do different things. So we're going to look at voice and tone, the expectations that are set up by beginnings that prime the reader for the story that is to come. What I kind of call the contract with the reader gets set up right away in the beginning. We're also going to look at how the opening sets up a particular situation, what I call the occasion of the telling. What makes the speaker tell this story now? Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. And we're also going to look at how beginnings set up the world creation in the story. So that's a whole lot for the first and second paragraph of a book or a story, but it all happens, believe me. So let's start with voice. The first thing that the reader discovers in the story is the voice that is telling the story. So that refers to the sound of the narrator on the page, or a sound of a character if it's a first-person narrator, or if the story begins with dialogue, and as you know, many books do begin with a line of dialogue. This sound carries with it many aspects. So a quality of tone: is the voice melancholic? Is it serious? Is it satiric? Is it plain spoken? Is it terse? Is it abrupt? It's kind of like meeting a new person. You learn that person's voice, and you haven't heard it before, so you have to get used to it. So anytime you start a new book or story, you have to get used to this voice that's talking to you. The voice gives us also a sense of language. Is the language simple? Is it ornate? Is it noirish, as in certain mysteries? Is it childlike? Is it poetic, to name a few possibilities? Some voices fall pleasantly on our ears, just as in ordinary life. Others are harder to grasp and require more familiarity by reading further. I mean, that certainly happened to me when I started reading Virginia Woolf. I wasn't used to her voice. It was difficult. And I had to read and keep reading to make that voice work in my head. Ultimately, if the voice of a story never feels enticing to you, you will most likely put the book aside or throw it across the room. So let's look at a few openings for voice. Here's the opening of one of my favorite classic stories by Catherine Ann Porter about a woman dying, the jilting of Granny Weatherall. She flicked her wrist neatly out of Dr. Harry's pudgy, careful fingers and pulled the sheet up to her chin. The brat ought to be in knee breeches, doctoring around the country with spectacles on his nose. Get along now, take your school books and go. There's nothing wrong with me. Now this voice is rural and is from an earlier time, either the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th. She uses words like doctoring and knee breeches and get along now, which you don't hear very much anymore. These words tell us that she is a plain-spoken woman and one with opinions, and indeed Granny Weatherall has opinions. She's older than the doctor, telling him to take his school books and go. She's in bed where she wants to be, and we don't know yet why she's in bed. but she intends to stay there. She does not want help, but to be left in peace. This voice makes us curious about what is wrong with Granny Weatherall, even though she says nothing is wrong. We suspect that we will hear more on this subject, and indeed, that is what the entire story is about. Let's look at another opening, this one from a memoir, Searching for Mercy Street, by Linda Gray Sexton, the daughter of the poet Anne Sexton. Her memoir starts this way. The letter, written on a single sheet of legal-length yellow paper, was folded several times as if it had been in an envelope. It lay in my dresser drawer, on top of the stash of letters housed in a rectangular metal box that had belonged to me since I was 12. A storehouse for all my most important and private documents. An envelope with a hank of my hair cut by my mother on Mother's Day in 1963. This was a box I would never be without. A box I perused from time to time as I relived small moments of my own history. I put my hand out and I touched the letter with one fingertip. Had I found it? Had I at last discovered the missing suicide note my mother must have written just before shutting herself into her car and starting up the engine? This voice is the voice of a writer. She's very careful with language. She's not colloquial as Granny Weatherall is. Writing itself means something to her. She saves a stash of letters, as well as her private and important documents. She situates us in time by saying a date when she is young, 1963. She is looking for something, and we come to find out it is her mother's suicide note, which she has never found in a number of years now. It's been, since the mother's death, at least 10. In the next paragraph, we find out that her mother is the famed poet, Anne Sexton. This voice is deliberate, sober, precise. It is the voice of someone very introspective who thinks a lot about what things mean. It is, we find, the voice of a daughter still trying to understand her mother and why her mother left her when she did, which has basically haunted her entire life. And she says so. A very different voice is from Eudora Welty's story, Why I Live at the P.O., which is another classic mid-20th century story that never seems to get old, I don't think. And it begins this way. I was getting along fine with Mama, Papa, Daddy, and Uncle Rondo until my sister Stella Rondo just separated from her husband and came back home again. Mr. Whitaker. Of course, I went with Mr. Whitaker first, when he first appeared here in China Grove, taking pose yourself photos, and Stella Rondo broke us up. Told him I was one-sided, bigger on one side than the other, which is a deliberate, calculated falsehood. I'm the same. Stella Rondo is exactly 12 months to the day younger than I am, and for that reason, she's spoiled. She's always had anything in the world she wanted, and then she'd throw it away. This voice is a comic voice, a sassy voice, a southern country voice. Character names like Papa Daddy, Uncle Rondo, and Stella Rondo call up characters from the pre-World War II South. She's also very defensive. Stella Rondo broke up her relationship with Mr. Whitaker. She gets everything and takes everything away from this sister. And then she throws it away because once she gets it, she doesn't care if she has it anymore. We know we're going to hear her version of events by the way she begins. Told him I was one-sided, bigger on one side than the other, which is a deliberate, calculated falsehood. We find, for those of you who know this story, and I encourage you to read it if you haven't, I mean, it really is a crazy story, that she has renounced her family and gone to live in the post office where she is the postmistress. The voice invites us into a colorful world, full of exaggeration, and full of her desire for us to hear the real truth, which is her truth. This is also a classic first-person story in which you know it's so biased, it's so subjective. You are not going to get the objective truth in this story. You are going to get sister's truth. And she's very defiant about it. All three of these very different voices set us up for a particular kind of story. The Porter story, an exploration of a woman's last days. Linda Gray Sexton's memoir, The Search for the Mystery of Her Mother, and by extension, The Search for Herself. Eudora Welty's A Comic Romp of Family Rifts and Jealousies. Each opening is an invitation to the reader, another key characteristic of beginnings. A story begins, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and the writer hopes the reader will follow. The invitation can be many things. In the Porter example, we're taken to an earlier time, to the mystery of why a woman has taken to her bed, a woman who does not want a doctor. In Searching for Mercy Street, the speaker asks us to go on a journey with her to find out what happened in her past that has shaped her present. In Welty's story, the speaker wants us to know her point of view, her version of a story we might have heard. And I'd like to add in that story that the narrator knits us into the story by treating us like we are community members, that we know this post office, that we are probably people who know Sister and go there to get our mail every day. So she's treating the reader of the story like her audience in this little town. Welty, with great generosity, often lets us see the foibles or shortcomings of her characters by what they say and do. She doesn't say to us they're funny or limited. She shows us. She lets her characters hang themselves. She never does it. In all three cases, there's a journey involved. A novel, a memoir, a short story, all take the reader on a journey she or he hasn't gone on before. The beginning needs to tantalize, or charm, or intrigue us to go on that journey. The beginning, as each of these does, has to set up a situation that demands exploring, that is unusual enough, or charismatic enough, or thoughtful enough to entice us to keep reading. In that sense, all stories are mysteries. They all open a door on the unknown, and we expect the writer to make this excursion worth our while. We expect to learn something, be entertained, think about things we haven't thought of before. And that all starts to happen in just that first or second paragraph. And if it doesn't, well, you know what happens. The book doesn't get read. Let's look more closely at how the beginning knits the reader into the story to entice the reader to continue forward. This is the opening of Larry McMurtry's The Last Picture Show, another classic story from the mid-20th century that most of you have probably seen the movie or read the book or heard about it. Sometimes Sonny felt like he was the only human creature in town. It was a bad feeling, and it usually came on him in the mornings early when the streets were completely empty, the way they were on Saturday morning in late November, the night before Sonny had played his last game of football for Thalia High School. But it wasn't that made him feel so strange and alone. It was just the look of the town. There was only one car parked on the courthouse square, the night watchman's old white Nash. A cold norther was singing in off the plains, swirling long ribbons of dust down Main Street, the only street in Thalia with businesses on it. Sonny's pickup was a '41 Chevrolet, not at its best on cold mornings. In front of the picture show, it coughed out and had to be choked for a while, but then it started again and jerked its way to the red light, blowing out spumes of white exhaust that the wind whipped away. So he paints us a fairly bleak picture of Thalia, Texas. This beginning is very atmospheric. We feel the small, almost empty town as Sonny does, its isolation, its loneliness, its mid-century, 20th century rural Texas. Feeling like the only human creature in town is something every kid growing up feels. So McMurtry has this great knack of just landing us right in close with his main character. Sonny is in his last year of high school. His whole life is in front of him. But right now there's only this almost empty town. He feels, as he says, strange and alone. McMurtry knits us into this opening with the emotions Sonny feels on this dusty, old, cold Main Street. We know the picture show will be important because of the title of the novel and the fact that Sonny's car has died in front of it. And it always dies in front of it. So we know that we are going to spend a lot of time at this last picture show. His life has effectively stopped for a minute. We know reading this that there will be a quality of stopped time in this book. This time in Sonny's life will never come again. He will never be a senior in high school again. He will probably never feel this strange or this alone. He doesn't know the future, only the past, and the present seems empty. The power of these details pull us forward. We want to know more. What is Sonny's past? What are his dreams? We know from these details he wants to leave Thalia with its lonely, dusty streets. How possible will that be for him? What will get him out? These kinds of questions come out of this occasion of the telling. Nothing less than the rest of this character's life is at risk in this opening. We want to know more even as we're chilled by that cold norther along with Sonny. McMurtry brings the reader into the story with these familiar details of young angst, feeling outside of things, wanting something more and something greater than has ever come before. The opening makes us yearn along with Sonny. Our expectations are that we will find out the answers to our questions, that we will go forward as the novel unspools into the details of Sonny's life. And always, always there is that central question: is this all there is? And this is a moment that all of us live and relive in our lives as we get older as well. Is this it? Is this my life right now? So McMurtry has really tapped into, I think, a universal feeling, if there is such a thing. We know it's not all there is. So the other central question is, how does Sonny escape? Partly because these youthful feelings have such pull, this opening has a lot of consequence for the reader. We also want to know more about this town and the people in it. We also get an intimation in that opening, and in the other two as well, that there's some risk here. There's some consequence for Granny Weatherall lying in bed. There's consequence for Linda Gray Sexton finding the suicide note if she finds it. There's consequence for Sister in the post office. Will she ever go home again, or is she going to live there the rest of her life? So the occasion of the telling that comes in the opening of a story always carries something momentous, even if it's a comedy. There's something here that is at risk for both the writer and the reader. All of these openings lead us into expectations of plot and what kind of story we're reading. So the opening also educates us into genre, theme, subject matter. Porter's older woman who doesn't want to get out of bed, we know we'll find out why and how she relives her life from that spot. Linda Gray Sexton's opening leads us into the mystery of the mother-daughter bond and her search for understanding its complexities. Eudora Welty's comic heroine, who has abdicated her home and family, will take us through her travails over and over. And McMurtry's Sonny will find a way out of Thalia and a way out of this lonely, isolated place that he finds himself in. I'll read one last opening, the beginning of my recent novel, The Day After Death, as another example of how the beginning tells us about the world creation of the story. Deep in sleep and shadow, the house stirs as the moon rises. Amanda wakes, aware of night sounds. The humidifier whines in the hall. The blinds tap, tap against the window in the breeze. The dreaming dog's nails click against the wood floor. When she hears her brother Adrian fidgeting in the room next to hers, she turns uneasily in bed. She hears the rude scrape of his headboard hitting the wall, a sound she's heard many times, and she pictures him flinging aside the blankets in his bed, pushing himself upright. Her chest hurts and she coughs, even though she tries not to. She hopes he will go back to sleep. Amanda fears what Adrian might do and where he might go during his night walks. Every muscle tenses with dread as she tries to breathe quietly through clogged sinuses. Don't come in here. So in this opening, we feel the isolation of the house in the night. The girl awakens and she hears night sounds, and we all know what those are from times when we can't sleep. It's 3 a.m., 4 a.m., whatever it is. In this case, she hears familiar things like the dog's nails clicking, the humidifier whining. But then she hears the uneasy fidgeting of her brother. And this signals that she is waiting for something. And therefore, so are we. The brother's night walks sound ominous to us. What does that mean, his night walks? The beginning promises a family conflict or secret between the brother and the sister that will be revealed in the course of the novel. This world is psychological and suspenseful. So you read that opening and you think, gosh, I'm not in the mood for suspenseful right now, so you put that aside and pick up something else. Or you think, oh good, that's just what I'm in the mood for. So the world creation starts from the very beginning. Each of these stories also has an evocative title. And this, of course, is your very first tool in constructing your opening and letting the reader know what he or she might be in for. And that's the first thing, if you're in a bookstore, that you notice, the cover and the title. And again, those either draw you in or they don't, or they make you curious enough to read the book jacket, or maybe the first page. If you're very lucky, people will read your first page. So I'm going to read these titles that we've looked at again, because they all give us big keys to what we have explored just a little bit of today. The Jilting of Granny Weatherall, Searching for Mercy Street, Why I Live at the P.O., The Last Picture Show, The Day After Death. All of these titles create an atmosphere and a promise that something in that title is going to be the through line of the book. And so these qualities are the power of beginnings. Voice, tone, the beginning of a journey, the reader becoming involved in another's world and conflicts, a character or narrator who begins to reveal herself or himself, the creation of a world, all are contained in those opening sentences. No wonder we write and rewrite the beginning more than any other part of a story or a book. And many people say, well, of course you can't write the beginning until you've written the end, but you do have to start somewhere. So you do write that beginning at the beginning, usually, although some people start in the middle of their stories. I've always envied that. That's pretty interesting. But that beginning is the thing you go back and polish and polish and polish, because you don't want the reader to throw your book across the room. You want the reader to want to read on. That beginning contains the seeds of meaning and pleasure for both the writer and the reader. Thank you. So now I'd like to take comments or questions